a lot of Trump's trade policy or his views on tariffs seem to be adopted during the late 70s and 80s when the U.S. was kind of the consumer of last resort. And it makes sense because a guy like Robert Lighthizer, who was Trump's former U.S. trade representative, is a big advisor. Well, Bob Lighthizer cut his teeth during kind of Reagan era trade policy, this area of kind of muscular unilateralism, where that type of market power perhaps existed in certain industries, but just doesn't exist anymore. In fact, there was a great paper from some guys at the Peterson Institute who they modeled out how a 10% tariff might work in today's economy. And they said, no foreign exporters are lowering their prices to get into the U.S. market anymore because the U.S. just isn't hegemonic, they call it, in world trade. And they said there are all these rival trading blocks, all these global supply chains. It just doesn't work like that. So, like you said, it's a kind of an antiquated view, but makes sense given some of the Trump advisors. Now, getting back to your other question earlier, do I think they're serious? Unfortunately, I don't know. It's, a little bit of criminology in all this, but I do think we have to take it seriously. First, there are only a few consistent views Donald Trump has held in his entire life. And tariffs and protectionism are one of those things, whether it's writing letters to the New York Times in the 1980s complaining about the Japanese, or behind closed doors conversations about tariffs and trade deficits. It certainly seems like this is one of the things that he really believes when it comes to policy. The other thing is that he's surrounded himself with, yes men or true believers. Peter Navarro, Bob Lighthizer. These are folks that really do think in these zero-sum trade terms, these 1980s trade terms. And so, and then
finally— Not to go too inside baseball on this, but question for you, a matter of judgment. So Peter Navarro is a crackpot.
Yes.
Is Lighthizer, or is he a more serious man?
I think he's much more serious. But like I said, he really grew up in a different era of global trade, but also he has represented for decades the U.S. steel industry, and he has very particular views based on that time in government, in law, and in terms of kind of economics and economic policy. And I think that has really affected his views about how a trade policy should work and how it does work. And it's kind of, I think one of the big problems with a lot of Trump advisors is they have a very microeconomic view. They come from business or from law, and they think that trade balances are like corporate balance sheets, and they don't either understand or don't recognize some of the macro things that make it not work like they think. And so that is, I think, just an issue that we have to take them seriously in terms of these issues, in terms of trade policy proposals, particularly—
I'm always surprised how many people I meet who think that trade deficits are like fiscal deficits and that they're cumulative and that there's some reckoning that has to come at the end of it.
And you hear from people who have been in the same room as Donald Trump, and he swears by the view that a trade balance is a scorecard for trade policy, no matter how many economists say otherwise. He really seems to believe this. Now, he's that cynical, I don't know, but he says this a lot. And again, not just in front of the TV. So I think we do need to take it seriously. And I think we also need to take it seriously because of how the law is set up. And this is something I've written about. We have a paper on this at Cato. The fact is that over the last 80 plus years, Congress has delegated vast swaths of its power over trade policy to the president. And it did that for somewhat reasonable reasons. After Smoot-Hawley, Congress realized it couldn't be trusted with all this tariff authority. There was a lot of corruption and just really bad policy that came out of congressional tariff setting. They gave the president all that power, but in retrospect, they gave him too much of that power. They can't get it back. And you have a situation where there are numerous laws on the books that allow the president to impose vast, broad tariffs without any congressional input. And in the last 7 years, we've seen the courts repeatedly refuse to challenge or to approve the challenges that have been brought. So in other words, siding with the executive branch, which I should note the Biden administration, to its great discredit, has been vigorously defending that executive power as well. So they've kind of set us up for what we might be in store for in the future. So do I know they're going to do this? Obviously not. Do I think they believe this? Probably. And can the law let them get away with it? Again, probably. So I think it's a risk that we need to take quite seriously.
Yeah, I'd like to get Alex in here, even though I don't know he's really here to talk about other stuff, although he's got views on trade and tariffs and things as well. Alex, you're a relatively young guy, and one of the things I'm not an economist. I used to teach writing now, and when I taught my persuasive writing class, my first exercise for the students is we would essentially reenact the Corn Law debates. And year after year, semester after semester, my students pretty much all came down on the free trade side of that debate. I'd make them make the case for both sides, of course, but at the end of it, when we would talk about it, they would say, obviously, yeah, the free traders had the better argument there. So we've been winning this debate since the 1840s, I guess. We have to keep having it over and over again. Like it's the old line about having to defend civilization from scratch every generation because you're invaded by barbarians in the form of your children. Why do you think this is such a durable way of looking at the world, this notion that we are somehow impoverished by the fact that there are people in other countries who want to sell us things at attractive prices?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually certainly we're dealing with having to relitigate this issue now, but I think over time there has been progress. I think in terms of reliance on tariffs as a revenue source, it's declined, historically quite a lot. Now, I think part of the reason for that is, at least, Trump recently was talking about how back in the 1890s, we got all our revenue from tariffs. Wouldn't it be great if we replaced the income tax with tariff revenue? Which, again, in addition to the point about revenue and protectionism being conflicting goals with tariffs, there just simply isn't that kind of money there to replace the income tax with tariffs, unless you hope to get rid of 80% of the federal budget. And maybe you will, but I don't believe you that you will.
I have some colleagues we should talk to.
Yeah.
It's funny because I'm in some ways a pretty radical libertarian, but the people who talk this sort of this kind of late 18th, early 19th century vision of the federal government, we're going to go back to not having a standing army and having a federal government that's got 18 employees or whatever it is so much more radical than anything I would actually talk about. Every now and then you'll hear from one of our progressive friends who will make the old dumb point about, in the Eisenhower administration, we had a top tax rate of 92%, and wasn't that great? And taxes were actually lower as a share of GDP significantly, but we also spent 80% of the budget on national security in 1956 and 20% on social services, not the other way around. If you even wanted to go back to that, would be so much more radical than anything someone like me is talking about. It's there's a persistent refusal to deal with reality, I think, and to accept the limits of what can be done in terms of policy, what can be done in terms of politics. But I think Scott is onto something here in that this will be something that the administration, if there's another Trump administration, will be tempted to do because of the way the powers have been delegated to the executive branch. They don't have to go get a bill through Congress. And in the interest of making a smooth and suave transition here, the Trump administration wasn't particularly good at getting bills through Congress last time around. But one of the big ones they did get through was a tax bill that was an utterly conventional Republican tax bill in a lot of ways that contained a lot of provisions that Alex likes and wants to talk about.
Yeah, so I think in some ways, I think the issues related to the tax expiration debate next year are sort of the opposite in terms of the role of the president of the process to the trade issues, where in trade it's going to be initiated by the president, and they have comparatively unchecked power over it, whereas the tax expirations, yes, the ball is in Congress's court, and neither Trump nor Harris are really talking about the tax expirations all that much.
If you do a little level setting, please explain what you're talking about with tax expirations.
Yes. So Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 did some was a combination of big tax cuts and structural reforms to the tax code. On the corporate side, it reduced the corporate income tax rate to 21% from the sort of outlier of 35. Introduced some limited full deductibility of investment in equipment on the business side as well. And then the individual side, broad rate reductions, expand the standard deduction, limits some itemized deductions, expands the child tax credit. And there are a bunch of other provisions. It was a pretty big deal. But point being, most of the individual provisions are expiring in 2025.
Why does that happen that way?
Well, everybody likes to kick the can down the road in Washington, I suppose. This is not so, you could have a smaller tax cut that you make permanent. People have I guess, going back to the people have to make policy with the 10-year deficit, window in mind.
For budget scoring, right, Alex?
Yes.
We're talking about marketing here, really. We're not talking about policy or economics. We're talking about the fact that they have these built-in expirations because nobody wants to come out and say that this tax bill will add X gazillion dollars to the debt over the next. What's like the longest expanse they do? 75 years or something like that? There's an infinite timeline thing you can do, I suppose, but they usually talk about, in the entitlements anyway, they talk about 75-year windows sometimes. We always do these 10-year windows for these things because we want to make sure we have a new fight over basics of, fundamental fiscal and tax policy every couple of years because we're being fun and having stability.
No. And, usually you have some kind of, back in 2017, it was a constraint about we want to aim for approximately 1.5 trillion was the number that they said this is how much we're willing to go in terms of deficit impact in the 10-year window. And so you say, well, we could do permanent stuff over 10 years or we could have it expire before 10 years, which means we can do a bigger tax cut in the shorter term. And to be fair to them, 8 years is better than doing a huge tax cut in 1 year and saying let's just kick the can down just one more year.
Do a great tax cut for a week.
Yeah, I think we could. Yeah, a week-long tax holiday. Let's not. I shouldn't have mentioned.
Don't give them ideas.
Let's
not give them ideas. So, out of the provisions that are expiring, which ones do you think are the most important to extend, or do you think any of them are important to extend?
Yeah, so I think there are the ones that I highlighted in the piece are related to business investment, and I think people sometimes there have been a couple of articles that had to be corrected recently that said the business provisions were permanent and the individual provisions are expiring, and this was a mistake, or a couple of articles that have said that, and I can't remember. I think it was Axios or something. Were wrong. That the corporate rate reduction is permanent, but there are a bunch of the pro-investment provisions that have already started phasing out or expiring. And
what are those pro-investment provisions?
Yeah, the 100% bonus depreciation, which in short lets companies immediately deduct the full cost of equipment, that started phasing down last year. Originally it was 100%, it's dropping to 80%, dropped to 80% in 2023, 60% in 2024, so on and so forth. And then R&D amortization, which requires deductions for research and development costs be spread out over the course of 5 years. And basically the significance of these policies is that spreading the deductions for costs out over time effectively means you can't deduct the full real cost because of inflation and sort of opportunity costs of having to put the tax benefits off till later, and that creates sort of a tax penalty on investment. And so these provisions, as far as the impact on the economy and growth, in wages. Investment's really important for that sort of thing. And of the provisions that are either expiring or have already started to expire, I think those would be the most important for long-term growth for the tax fight. And again, I don't think either of them have talked much about the 2025 tax expirations, like Trump or Harris. But it's going to be their problem whether they like it or not.
Yeah, and I would just add it's particularly frustrating because both of them are obsessed with manufacturing, right? And full expensing that Alex is talking about would be really good for capital intensive manufacturing, like all these semiconductor facilities we're subsidizing with tax credits and the rest. And so it's disappointing, I think, that here you have good tax policy staring them right in the face, and instead it's protectionism and subsidies and the rest of this junk that doesn't have nearly the bang for the buck. At Cato, my colleague Adam Michel and I did a little side-by-side looking at the potential cost of just a full expensing permanent provision versus what we've already done for industrial policy. So the CHIPS Act, the IRA, and it's way more expensive to do the industrial policy than it would be to have good tax policy and do it permanently. And yet, of course, again, the folks in Washington, they like the tax credits.